Okay, let's see if, can you see it?
Yes, full
Okay,
screen
cool.
and everything.
What about now? What do you see?
Presentation mode.
Is it full? It's good?
Yeah, we got the URL bar at the top, but other than that, it's
See if I can fix that. What about now? No?
has
Good.
not actually changed.
Oh, is it okay with the URL bar at the top? Is that
Yeah,
acceptable?
I think it's fine.
Okay, cool.
Don't think it's a huge problem. We can just ignore it.
Sounds good. This is my first time trying with like presenter mode where you actually see your own notes. Usually I just kind of wing it. Try a bunch of firsts for this talk.
You managed to get that set up? Okay, cool.
Yeah, it's working. I'm pretty proud.
Even after 1 year of like Zoom talks, I'm still kind of flying blind. I'm just like, here, you can see what I see. Like,
yeah, it's my first time.
I always make a mental note to like try it at some point, and then I never do it. So.
Yeah, also I'm hoping my outdoor situation will cooperate. Sometimes there's some noise because it is the ground floor in New York, but it's been pretty good today. So if it's loud, apologies in advance.
We'll manage. All right, I think we'll have a couple of minutes. I think there's a number of more people filing in. So let's give them a minute or two. All right. Good to see so many returning names and faces.
Hi all, ciao Paolo.
So today is this is the last one for this semester. Last
Hi,
DMI talk.
how are you doing? Very busy period for everybody.
Yeah. Ciao Paolo.
Hi, how are you doing?
Closing out on a high. Well, it's just been like a continuous high the whole semester, like all the talks. So good. Yeah, I think I mentioned this, Adina, right? It's a very mixed audience, which is very nice. So we get people from all different backgrounds, different academic fields, also practitioners, students, professors, everybody, postdocs.
Cool. Yeah, so if anybody has questions, I mean, I guess this is a sort of a psych-directed talk. I'm gonna not dive too deep into the technical aspects, largely because it's not that technical. But if anybody has questions about it, I'm definitely happy to take questions throughout. I don't know if that's your general style.
Yeah,
I mean, this is possible.
It's mainly up to the presenter. So if there are questions, please type your questions in the chat, and then it's probably easiest if I keep an eye on the chat, and Adina, I'll then just ping and say, hey, there's a question, and
that sounds good.
Read that out. That's typically the easiest one, because then you don't need to keep one eye on the chat and the questions, and it's sort of a bit more uniform.
That sounds great. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Adina. Very happy to have you here, closing out this semester of DMI talks with a very, very enticing title. It's my great pleasure to welcome Adina Williams today. She is a researcher at Facebook AI Research, also affiliated with New York University, where she was at New York University. She has a very broad background. She is versed not just in NLP, but also has like a background in linguistics, and which is not that unusual in NLP, but then also in neuroscience. So she really has like a very broad view of academic disciplines, and I think that shows in a lot of the work that she's doing, which can I say like one of the underlying themes is sort of like probing how much all of these fantastic, wonderful new statistical methods and gigantic networks tell us about human behavior related to language, but also, human behavior in general. And she has, published a number of very, very nice and well-cited papers on various aspects of that, from typological aspects of language to translation to gendered issues to biases. So really looking forward to the talk today, which is going to lead us deeper into this whole issue. So the floor is yours. Thanks, Adina.
Great. Thanks so much for the intro, Dirk. And if you're coming in just now, you can feel free to interrupt me along the way. Yes, the title is a bit provocative. This was a title chosen by my co-first author, April, who is a social psychologist at NYU, because it's pretty much a good summary of our findings. And I started working with both April here and Andre last fall. This paper is currently in progress, so there's not a draft I can share with you yet, but if you're interested, do ping me and I might be able to swing something. They're both social psychologists, so they have a really interesting and specific expertise in how social concepts manifest, and that's sort of the direction that we want to go in this work, sort of using NLP tools to get deeper insight into how our social concepts are constructed and how they behave at sort of a large kind of society scale, if at all possible. Okay, so to get started, I wanted to show you this picture of the Smurfs, which I'm sure that everyone recognizes as part of a lot of people's very fond childhood memories. And unfortunately, I might start by ruining the Smurfs for you. I definitely couldn't think of the, yeah.
Adina, I think we're not seeing your slides change. It still shows the title slide.
Oh, no. Okay. Maybe. What about now? Can you see them here?
Nope.
Okay. Let me see. So you don't see any movement at all?
No, for me, it only shows the title slide.
All right. Let me try to reshare and see what happens. Maybe I spoke too soon on the success of the presenter mode.
Yeah, it does show you the presenter slides, but it does not change the main ones.
Let's see now.
Sometimes there's like an issue if you share just an application, or you have to share like the entire desktop.
Okay. I mean, I don't even see it myself now. Interesting. All right, let me try again. Thanks for your patience, folks.
No problem.
Okay. Let me try one more time. Okay, so now what do you see? Do you see?
Yes, now it's full
Is it small?
Screen. No, it's full screen, shows everything.
What about now?
Yes, shows the title screen.
Does it move?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, yeah.
We got the Smurfs.
Awesome. All right, not good, easy fix. All right, so yeah, I'm going to start with the Smurfs. And yes, I'm going to ruin the Smurfs for you, so sorry. But I definitely haven't been able to think about the Smurfs in the same way myself after kind of thinking about it in the way that I'm about to share with you. So of course, if you try to describe what they are, there's some sort of little wildlife that lives in the forest in these little mushroom houses. And this is a popular children's TV show. If I want to kind of like introduce you to the Smurf themselves. So this is Papa Smurf. He's sort of the most important Smurf. He runs the village. This is Clumsy Smurf. So, he's always tripping over things. It's very hilarious. This is Grumpy Smurf. At least I think that's the right name. He looks pretty grumpy. Hefty Smurf, big weightlifter, very into, getting toned. Brainy Smurf, he loves reading. Vanity Smurf, very interested in himself. And then we have Baker Smurf, and finally Smurfette, right? And Smurfette has no other kind of interesting property other than the fact that she is a woman or a female Smurf. So all the other Smurfs in this group have some particular properties, interests, and traits, except for the woman that's only really described as being the woman. And so this is sort of a good example of the topic I'm going to talk about today, which is androcentrism. It's basically the idea that for humans, and I guess for Smurfs as well, the prototypical individual is a man, and the woman is sort of regarded as a different or a subset, a smaller subset of the possible humanity. So this is an idea that's been around for a long time in like the philosophy and gender studies literature. Just to give you some kind of things that people have said about it, to give you another handle to jump in on. Man is treated as human and woman as other. That's sort of what I've described so far with the Smurfs. Men are this neutral standard or norm, where women are marginal to the serious concerns of life, which are largely preempted by men. And this is a cultural level generalization about particular societies, including, I guess, the one that we live in, and it has been discussed since 49, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. It's a really seminal book, but Lakoff in linguistics, Robin Lakoff had an interesting paper in 73, which spawned a bunch of research into how kind of women talk differently than men. And most recently, The Lenses of Gender in 93 by Sarah Bem is a really cool kind of dive into this and how this kind of sociological concept has evolved and changed in the past, I guess, 50, 60 so years. So I'm going to adopt today the definition of androcentrism from my co-author April, which is the propensity to center society around men and men's needs, priorities, and values, and to relegate women to the periphery. So basically to think of them as secondary or different, and perhaps even defined only on the basis of their gender relations. So I've kind of just given you the example of the Smurfs and given you a definition, but there are a bunch of different examples that one could draw upon from our existing society to show ways in which the experience of men is placed at the center or is given more priority over the experiences of women and, let's say, non-binary people. So I'm going to give you a couple examples from a recent handbook article on this by Haggerty et al. From 2013. They span kind of the workplace, health, media, and representation, and then finally how we speak, how we express ourselves using language. Okay, so to start with the workplace, this is a classic example. I work in when I worked in an office, it was large space, very open, everybody's desks are all crammed in, and the temperature is set on the basis of the whole floor. So everyone gets the same temperature, and the temperature is actually set lower than what most of the women think are comfortable, or the smaller people in general. And it's constantly kind of an argument about what the temperature setting is. How do we warm ourselves up? People have like little blankets at their desks sometimes that they'll like put on their waists when they're working if it's really cold, particularly in the summer with the air conditioning. And so I thought about this a bit and kind of like researched it, like why is the temperature always so cold? And it turns out that the thermal regulation requirements by law, at least in the US and workplaces, are based on kind of a 1960s study of working men's comfort. So it was like basically a survey, like which temperature do you feel comfortable at? And as you can see in this picture of men's fashion from the 1960s, guys are wearing a lot more clothing than, let's say, one would generally wear in the summer in the US. So they'll wear like full trousers with socks, an undershirt, a collared shirt, sometimes a vest, and then like a sports coat. And this is what they would wear at work. And so they're really bundled up in there. And so you can imagine that if you're trying to keep somebody comfortable, a working temperature, if this is their outfit, you're going to have to keep the temperature pretty low. So the survey was based on the average man. So as standards for the average man's body will actually overestimate female metabolic rate by approximately 35%. And this kind of has added difficulties in the current day because we're obviously experiencing things like climate change, and keeping the temperature very low increases the energy consumption of buildings. And so residential offices and buildings add up to 30% of total CO2 emissions. I found it rather interesting that the amount of added emissions is roughly the amount of overestimate of female metabolic rate, right? So it's sort of like to make it a comfortable environment for this particular person who doesn't even exist anymore, the 70s or 60s working guy, we're really having a negative impact on the climate at the same time. So this is one example from the workplace. There's also various disparities that show up in medical treatments. So this will be things like healthcare for heart disease, surgery, peripheral artery disease, cardiovascular disease, critical care, and cardiovascular risk factors. One of the really common examples here is the fact that women are often undiagnosed for heart attacks simply because the way that they manifest heart attacks is very different from the way that heart attacks manifest in men. And so they just don't get noticed by the medical profession. And so then that can lead to negative health outcomes down the line. So this is sort of a result of the fact that in medical research, the man body type is used as the standard, and the woman is compared to the man as standard and thought to be like kind of deviating from that standard in various ways. And that often leads to poor health outcomes. Another example from the health domain is that roughly 8 out of 10 drugs that were removed from the US market between 97 and 2000, just a sample of years, were withdrawn because they had side effects that occurred mainly or exclusively in women. So basically that means that the drugs made it to being actually consumed by people before anyone realized that they had all of these side effects and had to be pulled post hoc after people had already been affected, basically. Also between 2004 and 2013, women suffered more than twice as many drug-related adverse events than men. So it was about 2 million for women and 1.3 million adverse drug effects for men. At least more recently, since 2013, there's been some improvement here. But let's say for some of the major illnesses, we're kind of still stuck on categories that were approved based on trials, including only or mostly men. So it's hard to know really like whether even the categorization of illnesses is going to be kind of uniformly good for even women. I mean, this is not even considering non-binary people, who are obviously an important category. So yeah, it seems like the healthcare profession also has negative disparities of considering kind of the man the standard. Another classic example is in the media. So this is a quote from Tuckman, Symbolic Elimination of Women by Mass Media. And she says that television, newspapers, magazines, and the advertising they carry largely ignore women or portray them as stereotypical roles of victim and consumer. And this is absolutely true. If you like open a magazine, you see all sorts of pictures of women kind of, maybe like this lady holding money or something, and they're trying to sell makeup or other things that are stereotyped for women in particular. And this, of course, also calls to mind the Bechdel test, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, that measures how women are represented in fiction, often in film. And basically it asks very simple questions such as, does the work feature at least 2 women who talk about something other than a man to each other for a certain period of time? There's also additional requirements that the women must be named. And as recently as 2014, the proportion of popular movies that pass this test hovers between, like from, let's say the beginning of cinema to 2014, it's around 30 to 35% of movies actually pass this test. So that's pretty low. It's pretty low that there's only 30% that have a scene of reasonable length where women talk about something other than a man. Suggesting that like this problem is still ongoing to this day. Though I think also recently people have been putting more effort into representation, and this is improving. Finally, this is one of my favorite examples. It's a space example. So there's a bunch of really exciting space stuff going on right now. So there's a Mars landing by NASA, and there's also a Mars landing by China as well recently. So it's very exciting to think about space. But the classic examples, of course, when men walked on the moon. There's a phrase here by Neil Armstrong, that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. And obviously in this quote, he's not thinking only of mankind as referring to people who identify as men. He's thinking about it as in like the wealth of humanity, all of humanity taken together. And he really was trying to express in this moment how, universal, important for all of us it is that we could put a human being on the moon. He's not trying to say something about men in particular, but the language at that time, at least, and to some extent now, kind of used the terms for men to refer to humans in general. And so you might think that this kind of androcentric thinking in the case of NASA is something, past. That's only Neil Armstrong's day when we had the first moonwalk. But actually, very recently in 2019, in March 2019, there was a planned all-women spacewalk by NASA, and at the last minute it had to be canceled because there actually weren't spacesuits that would fit women. There weren't 2 of them. So if you wanted to have 2 women in space at the same time, they would have to make more spacesuits. They didn't actually have them around. And so women have been, of course, doing spacewalks since the 80s. The first Soviet cosmonaut, Svetlana Savitskaya, was the first woman doing a spacewalk. But since then, there has been no time at which two women were spacewalking at once. And in 2019, the issue was basically the torso component of the two women. They required the same size and there wasn't enough. So they didn't have medium. And usually, of course, when people are discussing the design of women's clothing, it's not nearly as contentful as this example with the astronauts, right? Like you obviously need your technical materials, like your technical outfits to fit. So luckily, this spacewalk was rescheduled for later in 2019, and it was successful, and everything was fine. But the fact that NASA, this very large government-funded organization that's got a really interesting scientific message, the fact that they didn't have enough spacesuits as late as 2019 is, I think, fairly compelling, since they do have a reasonably large proportion of astronauts who are women these days. So I think that's kind of interesting as well. Okay, so those are all sort of examples of androcentrism as it exists in the culture, various different ways that it can manifest and be problematic. But there's also been a lot of psychological experimentation from social psychology on this question. So to get an idea of particularly individuals, do they, not just is society structured that way, but does it affect the way we think about ourselves in society? This is a recent one that I really liked. It's actually from my co-author, April. It's part of one of the projects one of the studies that got us excited about this project. And it's on implicit androcentrism. Men are human and women are gendered. So it's a similar kind of experimental version of some of the stuff that I'm going to present in a bit. And the main thing that she used to study this effect in that paper I just showed is the implicit associations task. I'm sure a lot of you guys are really familiar with this one. It was also used in the CalScan paper, that really popular 2017 CalScan paper that showed stereotypes are present in our word embeddings. And the way that the implicit association task generally works is that people are faster and more accurate when they're trying to pair together concepts that are conceptually linked than when they're trying to pair together concepts that are not conceptually linked. And so basically how this works is you'll have your keyboard and you take your two index fingers and put one on each far away button, maybe I think it's I and Q or something. And you're asked to bin words into two different bins. And so each bin is defined disjunctively. So it'll be words for women and flowers, or words for men and bugs. And the idea is that flowers and bugs are something that you have positive or negative associations with. And if you have more positive associations with women, then if you see lady, you're going to be quicker to put it in the woman or women or flowers category. Say with rose, you'll put it in the women or flowers category, as opposed to if you see woman and bug, then you'll be kind of slowed down. So if the two concepts are conceptually linked, then you will push the same key to put them together. And if they are not, you'll push different keys. And so what April did in her experiment was she looked at names. And so she had names like Diane or Joseph, and also words for women or words for people. And she showed that people were pretty fast with Diane. They were very quick to put it in the bin with a female name or woman, but they were very slow to put like Joseph or to push Diane into the other bin when it was the cross bin. So basically it's a classic IAT result. It's easier to associate female names with woman than it is with person. Basically, it suggests that androcentrism, it's easier to associate person with men than person with women. And this had a bunch of different category words. So the person category words, I think she had 4, actually it's not a bunch, it's like 4. She had human, people, person, individual, and humanity. And then man-gendered words like male, man, sir, he, and him, and female category words like female, woman, lady, she, and her. This was all done on MTurk with a large amount of participants. And keeping track of how quick all of these things were, and basically found this difference, that it's faster to associate with one than the other. And looking at this by effect size, you can see the D-score, which is the effect size, is slightly larger when the participant was a man than when the participant was a woman, but it was significant in both cases. And you can also see the huge spread. So towards the top of the y-axis, that suggests men are more prototypical as people. Towards the bottom, it suggests that women are more prototypical as people. And you can see that even for participants who are women themselves, a lot of them kind of move towards men as the main prototype. It wasn't that women think of women as more prototypical, men think of men as more prototypical. It's that everyone thinks of men as more prototypical. And one other thing that she did that I thought was especially cool in this project is she asked for something like a make sense rating. So she presented people with sentences and asked if they made sense. One of them would be, he is both a man and a human being. Another would be, she is both a woman and a human being. And the idea is that this should feel redundant, right? Like a man and a woman, both of these are human beings. They're both equally good examples of human beings. Roughly 50% of each in the human population. But somehow when people see he is both a man and a human being, they feel like it's more redundant than if they see she is both a woman and a human being. It's sort of like if you saw something that like this bird, or this is a robin and a bird, right? Like that feels super redundant because of course a robin is a bird. And so that redundancy feeling comes out more in the case of men, suggesting that that's the prototypical interpretation. So yeah, you can think about it like she is both a robin. This is both a robin and a bird. This is both a penguin and a bird, right? The second one is a bit less redundant feeling. And so she found that this is true in both cases. So for this make sense rating, you can see that there's a bit more variability from the large error bars, but it's they both make sense here. But people generally feel the sentences are less awkward with the woman because the make sense rating is higher than with the men. So it's sort of, they both makes pretty much sense to say this is a man and a human, but saying, yeah, but this is an X and a human where X could be man or woman, but saying this is a man and a human is slightly lower. So this is suggesting that, yeah, it's more weird. Okay. So this is androcentrism or male bias. And the level at which this kind of conversation is relevant for us is that this is a claim about the structure of the concept that we usually refer to with words like human and people, not necessarily about like the individual person's view of this thing, even though we can try to get at we can try to use the individual's views to adduce evidence for the larger cultural meaning. So if people conceive of men as more prototypical, then people think of the generic person as a man. Of course, this is not correct. And there's no principled reason by which we might think men should be more prototypical, but it appears to be how people think about each other, about ourselves. So that means, conversely, as I said somewhat before, women are conceived of as women in terms of their gender and not necessarily as people, despite the fact that there's no scientific basis for this at all. Okay. So what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do to measure this effect in word embeddings? So the evidence so far kind of looks at individual concepts, the way that people think about these individual things, including April's experiment that looked at individual participants and measured what they felt. But what we're more interested in this study is trying to get a measure at the level of culture of this effect. So it's not just that particular individuals might think of men as prototypical and women as kind of secondary. We want to find out whether this is a cultural trend overall. And this is the point at which we try to bring in some of the more NLP related information. So we really are very curious to look at word embeddings here. So one thing is that we're not really sure whether we've hit on the right way to describe this problem so far. So we kind of are saying societal, cultural, we're adding a lot of slashes here. We're still trying to figure out exactly how to phrase this because we are kind of looking at this larger collective point. Of course, there's going to be a relation that's impossible to avoid between individuals and the culture because the individuals and their actions taken together constitutes more or less the culture. But we're interested in thinking of sort of the collective meaning of concepts and the words that we use to refer to them as a reflection of a bunch of private thinking, and it might actually kind of take on a different behavior than each individual's private thinking when viewed individually or privately. So it's kind of the thing that we're curious about is by no means like obvious from a study of 100 Turkers that it's going to come out. So like if you picked a particular sample of Turkers that aren't that aren't representative of the culture or potentially have very strong views, you might not actually get all of the information you want. You're only taking a small sample. So ideally what we would want is to take like a very, very large sample and looking at how these concepts behave across as large a slice of the population that we can find. And the reason why this is sort of an important way to look at it as like a collective as opposed to an individual thing, is that it might help us understand how these biases in our culture persist, despite the fact that we are trying to eradicate them both individually and on like a larger cultural level, like trying to create a better representation in movies and ourselves just kind of questioning a lot of these things in recent years. Despite all those efforts, these biases still persist. And if there is something like an overarching collective concept, then people who are born into our societies will be taught that concept. And in a sense, it will transmit then culturally over time. And so if we figure out how to describe this cultural thing, we can then create better interventions, or at least different interventions that might be more targeted towards that cultural level, as opposed to changing the individual minds of individual people. But of course, how best to do that is an open-ended question. So how do we measure something? Oh, I think I have a question. Joaquin?
Yeah, hi, this is Joachim.
Hi.
I have a question about the, maybe I'm getting it wrong, but so my understanding is there's androcentrism in terms of people's behavior, so how they behave towards men and women and how they express their views or so. And then there's androcentrism that is expressed in language, which the way we use words and how we, when we talk about mankind, we don't talk about humankind, but mankind or something like this, right? Yeah. And so it's easy for me to see that the latter is a reflection of the former. You seem to make the argument that the latter also causes a former, which I'm not sure. Is that true? Do we know whether there is the way people use language has an impact on how they treat people?
Yeah, so that's actually a very deep and complex question. And as a Chomskyan, I'm a Chomskyan linguist, so I am more of the mind that there's a language creates a lot of things in itself, and not in the sense that it affects culture, but it is a reflection of culture is my general take as well. But there is a lot of research showing over time that things can shift. And so at least generationally, like word meaning shift, new words are created, all of these things do happen. And so if we were, let's say, to change in a magic, shake your magic wand and change all of the references of humankind and mankind or all the ones from mankind to humankind, we could then check whether that would have a direct result. It's somewhat hard to do that in the real culture as it exists now. But yeah, I think that the language is a reflection of the culture, but both of these things are constantly changing. And so they can, at least at the edges, reinforce a bit in various contexts. So it's not the case that language is only a reflection of culture or only shapes culture. It does a bit of each, I think. It kind of depends on what aspect of language you're interested in talking about. Does that answer your question? No.
No. Go ahead, maybe we can talk later. Thanks.
I think there's another.
Yes, from a psychosocial point of view, because I'm social psychologist, I will say yes to the question that Joachim met. Because, for example, in his seminal work about the stereotypes, Lindman said that we don't see and after define, we define and after we see. Then language creates reality, because we are not able to see these things that we are not able to recognize. It means that we are not able to see the things for the words we haven't a word. You know what I mean? In my horrible English, I explain myself. Then language not only reflects reality, language creates reality. Then
I think I agree that it's kind of a cycle, and it's hard to know how it started at the beginning. But at least now that it's existing, they're kind of co-strengthening each other and changing each other.
Yeah, but for example, you cannot go to a conference and to say I'm wachi-wachi, because nobody understands what wachi-wachi is. Then, in this sense, it's clearly that language presents more often orality. Well, that's my only to contribute your debate.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the contribution. Yeah, so this is obviously a very contentious portion in the field, and I myself kind of take each side for different parts of language. So some things I think are very basic and are not affected by culture. So the basic combinatorial mechanisms of making, let's say, a verb phrase from a verb and a noun phrase. I mean, those things, all languages have that. And so that's universal, and it's not going to necessarily change by your culture. Like everyone does that, it's not going to shift. But then things like the meanings of words, those can be shifted. And I think singular they is an interesting example of this, even in the functional domain. So people are starting to use singular they as kind of a different pronoun that refers to somebody whose gender is either unknown or who's chosen to be not male or female, but something in between. So there are changes, and yes, it's very complicated. And unfortunately, I think I might have to punt on the exciting conversation, but we can try to hold on to it and come back to it at the end, because it also maybe the results that I'm going to show will have some interesting framing for that sort of a question, hopefully. I don't know, we shall see. But yeah, that's a good question, very hard and contentious. Okay, right. So yeah, I'm kind of aiming at this cultural level version of a concept, which of course exists in many people's minds at once. And to do that, I sort of want to take the largest possible sample of the language of interest, in this case, we're using English, as we can, to kind of sample the way that different people use different terms to get at the meanings of those terms. So this is an idea going back to Zelig-Harris, at least, on distributional semantics. It's usually typified by this phrase, "you shall know a word by the company it keeps." And that basically means that the way that you use a particular term, like man or woman, the meaning that those terms have can be gleaned from the words that they appear around. So if you talk about men in a particular way and talk about women in a different way, that can give you a clue into what those words mean and how those words differ. So it has to do a lot with context of use, and what other concepts are around. So how do we talk about men and women? So if you think back to the Smurfs example, there's the boy Smurfs, or whatever you want to refer to the male gender of Smurfs. The boy Smurfs have many different properties, and you would talk about them doing tons of different things. But the woman Smurf only has like one property, and mainly she's going to be talked about in relation to women things. It's not really, I mean, maybe she also will bake sometimes, but like, whether these are kind of integral properties of the particular categories is less clear. Okay, so how do we formulate our particular question today? So basically, we're going to formulate that as, are the concepts human or humans and men closer in the embedding space than the concepts human or humans and women? So is there some closer relation in the embedding space between the former and the latter? And so we're going to use word embeddings, the typical kind that people are familiar with from NLP, to measure, to stand in for the meanings of these concepts, and then look at the relations between man words in these concepts and woman words in these concepts, and see if they're at all different. And so we need a large corpus. We're going to use the Common Crawl corpus. It's approximately 2.8 billion web pages scraped in May 2017 in English, or largely in English. I'm sure there's some other languages in there somewhere, but mostly English. The number of English word tokens present in there is approximately 80 billion. This is a pretty large swath of the internet. I think it's a reasonable sample. Of course, it's crawled. There are always things you can always think of ways to crawl better. But this is a relatively standard, large and accessible data set that is a reasonable slice of the way that people are talking about our world in English. We're also going to use word embeddings trained with fast text. These are static word embeddings. These are largely based on co-occurrence, some other things. But the findings that I'm going to show you are not specific to fast text. We also checked with Glove and Word2Vec, and everything holds in those as well. It's just, fast text is convenient, and it's one of the better static systems right now. Okay, so how are we gonna particularly measure this? Conceptual distance. We're gonna take for each type of words. So for humans, women, and men, we're going to take approximately 30 or 35 exemplars, things like person, people, women, girls, male, boys. All of these are unambiguously referring to a person, or a person who is identifying as a man or a woman. And we're going to take these and measure the difference between their word embeddings as proxies for their conceptual meaning using cosine similarity, which is the standard mode of measuring similarity. And basically it's like a geometric similarity measure. So how are we going to calculate this? We're going to try to take the average. So we would take basically the average of the word person with all of the woman words. So the difference, the cosine similarity between person and she, person and woman, person and lady, et cetera, and do the same thing with men. So we do person and man, person and he, very similar to how CalScan proceeded. And then we would move on to the next person word. So then we would look at people, then we would look at human, et cetera, et cetera. And so from this, we can get sort of an average similarity metric of the relation between human words and women words. The idea being that all of those words sort of point in slightly different ways to the same overarching concept, or at least to a similar space of overarching concepts. And the prediction here would be that the similarity between words for human and words for women will be less than the similarity between words for human and words for men. And that's because men are thought of as the prototype. That's our hypothesis, the androcentrism hypothesis. So we're trying to basically look at that hypothesis using a different kind of cultural view. So thinking of word embeddings as sort of a distillation of culture in some sense, of this large corpus of text. Okay, so I'm going to show you the initial results here in just a sec. I want to make sure that we're ready to receive them. So on the y-axis is cosine similarity. On the x-axis, we're going to see words for men and words for women. And I'm going to be plotting box plots that show kind of the similarity to the human words. And we do find, as we expected, that the similarity between words for men and words for humans, this green box, is higher than the ones for word for women and ones for human. And so this was statistically very significant with a roughly medium-sized effects of 0.04 Cohen's d. You can see there that the box plot gives you also the distribution of the words themselves. It's pretty, a little bit more variation for women, but not much. And so these are significantly different. So at least based on the first stab, it seems like the androcentrism hypothesis holds true. So it is the fact that words for men are closer to words for people than words for women are. So, we can just say this, maybe you guys are satisfied, maybe you agree and you're done. But we wanted to also run some robustness checks to make sure that, nothing else could be going on, just to be sure, however we cut the data, that the results come out to be same. So we can, increase our trust in these findings. So the first thing we did was, as I mentioned, we pre-registered replication with GLOVE and Word2Vec. We found here a slightly higher effect size for GLOVE in the same direction, still significant. We also checked for undue influence from specific human words. So we looked at the words themselves. So, is human different from person in some specific way that is a problem for our analysis? And the way that we did this is we would leave out from our calculation one specific human word. So that would be like that word compared to all the male and female words on both sides. And we looked at how that affected the effect size for removing every single one. So you can see here on the bottom, these are the person words that were omitted. And the effect size roughly stays pretty much the same in the mid 40s. The original here is this triangle, but it drops at lowest to 0.42, and all of these effect sizes are still significant. So it's not that any particular human word is driving our effects in particular. It's all of them together. None of them is special. We also weighted the similarity score. There's a cosine similarity for each human word by how well it represented the human category. And so in order to do this, we had to get ratings from individual people. So we took, I think it was 6 raters who were blind to the hypotheses and asked them to rate like how good an example of a human word this is from 1 to 9 on the Likert scale. And so all of our human words were found very similar, but we also added a term into our mixed effects model to model that, and found that even if we add in that weighting, we have still roughly the same effect, still significant. So it's not that, this is somewhat related to the leave one out test, but with weights. We also removed masculine generics. So these are examples like mankind from the Armstrong quote. And the reason why we removed these is it's possible that the whole effect was driven by them alone. And we wanted to see if that was the case, and it was not. So if we removed all those masculine generics, we also removed the like woman non-generic counterparts of those just to be parallel, and the result maintains just the same. So it's not that those particular terms are, let's say in aggregate, like to leave one out will just tell us whether one of them is affecting it, but even in aggregate, they're not affecting the result. The next robustness check that we used was a non-parametric permutation test. So we basically permuted the data 10,000 times, randomly shuffling the category of the gender words. So sometimes he would be binned in with the woman words. And if what we were looking at was a real result, then we should see the original here, again, a triangle, kind of farther than the 95% of this bell curve. And this is what we see. So if it was just due to chance, you would expect the original to be somewhere in the middle there when we shuffled things around, and it was not. This is again significant at 0.001. So we also were curious about the frequency of these words. So it is relatively well known that there can be frequency effects on word embeddings. So we wanted to check that. Common Crawl, another reason we wanted to use fast text Common Crawl is that it comes with a rank ordering of the frequency of terms. Of course, the top is the, and then it goes from there. And so we use the rank ordering to determine whether the frequency was underlying the effect as opposed to something else, like the fact that it was a word from the man category. And we found no evidence of any difference in the ranked frequencies between the male and women words. So they're roughly as frequent as each other. So it can't be that frequency is confounding our results. So that was like a bunch of different robustness checks, kind of as many ways as we could imagine cutting it. I'm sure there's other ways that one could cut it as well. But no matter how we sliced in these various ways, when we were looking at sort of these terms as extracted from the English-speaking internet, we found this evidence that we think now is fairly robust, that our culture sees men as more similar to like the overarching category of human than woman. So that's kind of the first step. So from that, maybe I should ask if there's any questions. There are more predictions that we then go on to check, but does anybody have questions so far? Yes.
Yeah, I have another question. So I thought, and I don't know whether you have this data, if you could analyze different languages and compare, for example, Norwegian and Swedish to certain Arab dialects where we have societies that have a much stronger, who seem to embrace androcentrism to a much greater degree. And so it would be nice to see whether that's reflected in their use of language. Right?
Yeah. So we've been thinking about the best way to extend this work to multilingual, multicultural. There are a lot of things one could try. It's something that we definitely want to follow up on. There was one study particularly relating to Arabic that might be interesting to you. I mean, we haven't looked at Arabic, but they were looking at occupations in particular, as whether they were like stereotypical occupations of men and women. And they found the actual percentages of people who occupied those different occupations, and found kind of jobs that differed vastly across those two cultures, and showed that despite the fact that the actual representation could be swapped, so it's like women were more likely to be computer programmers in the Middle East, which is actually true, that the stereotypical effects were still maintained in the cultures where the actual representation was swapped. So that was kind of an interesting result. But yeah, totally an interesting question. It would be good to check, and it's on the list, but we haven't gotten there yet. Very cool. I think Michal?
Yes, I have two questions. The first is, how far are men from women? So is man closer to human, or is man closer to women? This is the first question, just to compare. And second, do you have any measure of variance of meanings of men and women, so that we could say, for example, because the story about Smurfs also says that you have many ways of being a man and only one stereotypical normative way of being a Smurfette. And this could mean also that you have only one, or that all ways of describing women are quite close, quite clustered. And for men, you have a whole variety of meanings of man.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the second one, that's part of the 2 additional predictions that comes up in the next part of the talk. But for your first question, this is the similarity. So the men words on average are more similar to the human words. So this is a direct measurement of how similar they are in embedding space. So this is, yeah. So
Yes, but this is the measure how close men are to human, right?
Yeah.
And my question was, are men closer to human or are men closer to women? So you compare
I see.
men to humans and women to humans. And my question is, how close are men to women? Also in relation to both of those categories to human.
Yeah, we could check. I mean, they can't, yeah, that's a good question. I should check. I don't have that results off the top of my head. But on the latter one, oh yeah, Berta, thank you for the question as well.
Only to say that in my PhD, I compare how a minority, gypsies, were closer to the animal than to the human. It will be interesting maybe for your future work also to take this, because there is a line of, of comparison between human and animal, and in the middle, there is the main group, and minorities and women are always closer to the animal. Then, well, was the question of Michael that suggests me to give you this insight.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. The kind of like animal references to humans. So the ones that we do look at, we don't look at that one, but you're right, that would be a very cool one to check next. The ones that we do look at are traits and actions, but it would be interesting too to look at other terms, maybe terms that were particularly marked as stereotypical regardless of their like syntactic category. Or
some social psychologists from Europe compare these kind of emotions that are more typical for human or that are also shared with animals. And they study prejudice using this dimension of human emotions and not less human emotions. Well, I mean, there is an enormous amount of possibilities only to give you these ideas.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I will definitely look into those again, because that might be very cool to check. Right, so the predictions that we check, and so we could have, it's true that we could have gone through things like animals or maybe words for leader or words for home or various other things. But one of the things that we were really curious about, given that these word embeddings are trained distributionally, or one of the things we wanted to be careful about is to make sure that we were only making comparisons within kind of certain well-described syntactic category. So at the moment, we were mostly looking at least in the beginning, comparing nouns to nouns. So you can substitute in a sentence and have it be still grammatical, any man word for any woman word, more or less. So if you say, I saw a man walk by, you would replace that with I saw a woman walk by, and it's still a grammatical sentence. And so they have similar syntactic distributions. And so that was part of why we wanted to make that direct comparison. But you're right, there are a lot more possible options there. And for these later ones, we do comparisons with traits, which are largely describing emotions. We didn't have the split between animal or human, but they are largely describing emotions or personalities. And verbs, which are largely action-based. Okay, so to get into that portion, let's go back to the Smurfs for a second. So as you all saw immediately, the boy Smurfs are the ones who display all the psychological traits. They can be grumpy, they can be vain, but the Smurfette doesn't really have any of these particular traits. I mean, even let's say if you look at Vanity Smurf, stereotypically caring about your appearance is probably more associated with women, but this is a property that Vanity Smurf has, right? It's like his defining property. So it is possible, at least in the Smurf world, for this to apply to boy Smurfs. So they also do all the things, reading books and leading the village and baking and everything else. So it seems like regardless of whether an action is stereotypical of a woman or a man, men seem to be able to do them all in a useful sense. So we're going to kind of summarize that fact in these two kind of quick short summaries that are going to describe the next two experiments. So men have all the traits and men do all the things. So what this predicts then, if we just kind of summarize these hypotheses in this way, is that the similarity between men and trait words will be higher than the similarity between women and trait words, and the same for verbs. So if it's true that kind of men can do everything, they aren't restricted, they're prototypical, then the similarities there should be higher. And we do find this to be the case. So here you can see again, the green is for men and the reddish is for women. We took a list of almost 600 traits that's published by Saucier and colleagues in 2019. Things like abrupt, absent-minded, abusive, accommodating, acquiescent, acquisitive, adaptive, active, and it just, very large. And measured for each of those, kind of, does the man if we take a man word as a pivot and measured each of them, like, just as before, distributively, do we see higher similarity for man words than women words? We also ran all of the same robustness checks and the results were the same. So these passed all the robustness checks as well. This was significant with a slightly smaller effect size. But it does seem then that if we are taking similarity in the semantic space as some notion of like conceptual social similarity, then these are more similar. We also looked at a different kind of subset of these traits that were marked, well, actually, oh, wait on that one. Okay. So we have, oh, sorry, here are the verbs as well. They're very similar plots, right? It's just kind of the stability of this effect. We also looked at 252 verbs of kind of varying argument structure. They were mostly action verbs. These are things like adore, allow, appeal, appear, appease, argue, ask. And we found basically the same effect here as well. So the male words were more similar to these verbs than the female words were to those verbs. Again, not quite as strong of an effect size as the human words, but still a reasonable size, maybe small, but it's there. And this, so it does suggest like that this hypothesis that we had is true, that not just are the words themselves similar, but other kind of words are also more similar to men. So men seem to be able to have all the traits and do all the things, at least in the common crawl. So it seems like now I have 3 experiments that show sort of the same thing, that all pass the robustness checks. And so at this point we were like, okay, based on all of these words in common crawl, fast text training, that suggests that people are, the prototypical person is a man. And that kind of was where we got our flashy title from. Yeah. Okay, so this seems pretty straightforward. I've been kind of talking about this completely separate from the idea of stereotypes, right? Although there is a wealth of literature in NLP and in computational social science particularly about stereotypes, that finds things such as that the word embeddings for male words are closer to career or science words, whereas the word embeddings for women generating words are closer to home and liberal arts and everything else. And so then kind of the question arises, where does our results leave us with respect to these stereotyping results? So what is the relation between these things? So for us, given our hypothesis, you might expect that stereotypes would be particularly pronounced for women, right? So that women are closer to women things, men are closer to man things. And is that still the case? We showed that kind of man words are close to everything, but do you see a stereotype effect still kind of within that? So in a sense, the stereotyping is like a main effect, or is like kind of is a main effect where we're looking at something like an interaction. So are men words just more similar to everything? Is that just what it's like, even stereotypes? So we took some lists of stereotyped words then to ask this question. And we grouped them into masculine and feminine stereotypes based on independent evidence, so publications in the social psych literature. We also had our raters rate whether the stereotyping traits, or whether the traits were stereotypic of men or women or neither. And we find this kind of really interesting effect here in interaction. So it is true that on the left side of this plot, words for men are relatively similar both to women stereotypic traits and man stereotypic traits. But words for women are more similar to women stereotypic traits than man stereotypic traits. So if you're a man, you have all the traits, but if you're a woman, you only have women stereotypic traits. And this is a significant difference here. We found the same thing in verbs. So in verbs, we found that the similarity for stereotypic verbs, and this was stereotypic on a particular argument slot. So we had an independent resource that pulled verbs out of parsed Wikipedia, based particularly on whether its subject or its object would be used more for a man or a woman. And so in the paper, which will come out soon, we actually split this down a bit more by the argument slots itself. But we find that even if the verb has a slot that's highly stereotypic of one or the other, the men words are similar to both, where the women words are only similar to the stereotypic verbs for women. So those would be something like, I don't know, hug or cry or something. Okay, so let me see. Is there anything else I should say before I start my sum up? I think I can start my sum. So there's a lot of things left to do, and there's a lot still to explore here. But we've kind of talked about these concepts of woman as though it was like one thing, and partially my framing of looking at it at the conceptual level made that possible. But individual people's concepts about men and women and their stereotypes about them differ a lot by particular individual, and also stereotypes don't necessarily hold of every individual. So how to bridge that gap is still really a pretty open question, how to bridge between the individuals and the culture. One of the things that we're hoping to do now that I think is really exciting is to bring in kind of another social variable. Particularly, we're going to look at race, because that also at least manifests somewhat in language. Other ones can be a bit hard. They don't manifest as often in language, like only a few lexical items, let's say, that refer to those, like let's say, class-based information. There's not a whole bunch of individual terms, though of course we can think of ways that are less individual term-based, which would be great. But we want to look at this intersection with race and gender. So if man is the prototypical human based on this measure, this cosine similarity measure, what happens when you add in a racial term? Like, is Asian man as prototypical of human as man is? Or is white woman as prototypical of human as man is? And like, what is the prototypical human? Is it man, or is it, like, let's say, white man or something? So we're looking at, this is something that we have ongoing right now. We're also really curious to try to incorporate more work on non-binary gender. So there are some cool ways to do this, and in the intersectionality project, or in the intersectionality thing we're thinking about now, we're hoping to incorporate non-binarity as well. Also, I mean, this work is so far in static word embeddings alone. It'd be kind of cool to extend that beyond, which is something I think should be pretty straightforward. We just haven't done it. Another thing that might be interesting is to train on corpora that are, let's say, woman affirming. So this is a result of the general internet. It's possible that the people who wrote all of these pages on the internet were themselves primarily men, or primarily of a particular background that really just didn't have as much incorporation of other thoughts, other ways of doing things. So if we could find a way to, or if we can find better corpora to train on here, that would be very cool. Someone else brought up the multilingual aspect, hoping to do that. That will be really great. Then also we want to think a bit about potentially acquisition. So there's a similar lab that's doing some acquisition work, training on child-directed speech to find if stereotypes manifest very early. Anything you can do with stereotypes, you can also do if you look at, you can also look at androcentrism through there if you just look at the interaction, right? So in a sense, every single stereotype finding could be investigated for whether it has an androcentrism result as well. And I think that would be kind of an important thing to consider, because it's just like, it's an obvious thing to ask, but somehow it hasn't come to the forefront until now. Okay, so I think that's roughly the sum of it. I hope that you guys enjoyed the project, and I would love to hear your questions.
All right, thank you very much, Adina. Great. So the floor is open for questions, and as always, I would encourage everybody to ask questions, and like especially junior researchers or junior members of the audience, not leave it to sort of the more senior members first. All right, we got one question already, Berta.
One question, Adina. Well, it's great, the job that you are doing. Congratulations, very, very interesting, the talk. Thank you very much. And I was intrigued about the similarity results, because if I don't know if I understood well, because I'm not a computer science, I'm a social psychologist, then sometimes I have some difficulties to understand. But did you find that women traits were less similarity than men traits?
Yeah, so we didn't actually, just like in the human one, we didn't compare the traits directly, which sounds like we probably should compare woman and man, and women's stereotypic traits and man's stereotypic traits independently of kind of the pivot to the individual noun.
I was asking myself, because I mean, I was asking to understand this result, because it's true that could be, I don't know, that the pressure of androcentrism is strong in the case of men. I mean, patriarchy needs that men follow the rules, and will be interesting to see if there is a closer similarity or this between men than you get my point. I mean, it's
I missed the last bit.
No,
Sorry.
okay. No, the point is, it's interesting to see, to compare if men are described with less threats and more homogeneity in this group than women, because that will indicate that the pressure of androcentrism is not only pushing women, but also makes a pressure in terms of masculinity to conform the stereotype of a real man. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so it is, at least this result here suggests to me that you can describe men with all of the traits, although the green box is the man stereotypic traits, similarity to the words for men. It's the average is higher, although that's not a significant difference there. So the average of similarity with men to men stereotypic traits is higher, although it is not different from the similarity to women's stereotypic traits. So it does suggest that you can use all these traits to describe men, and you use fewer to describe women. But we could go back and check like actual corpora and see which descriptions were used, like how, what's like 5 windows or something, like how far is it from the term, and is it like which ones are more prevalent. But this should kind of capture that co-occurrence information itself. Like that's sort of the idea behind these word embeddings, is that they capture co-occurrence in text.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yes.
Another. Yeah.
I had a question. This was really fun. Thanks for all this. It's I had one question about the thing about men can do all the things and have all the traits. I was actually a bit surprised by that. In some ways, I feel like this idea of androcentricity would go in the opposite direction, that kind of things that are female would be more salient. Just like when you think of female ways of dressing, they're very noticeably similar to female, whereas male ways of dressing are often not. And so I was just a little surprised, and I guess I wasn't sure, like, are you taking an average of all of these trait words and verb words? And is that, it seems a little tricky, because how do you know you picked the right words, and do you average them? Do you weight them by frequency or things like that?
Yeah, so we did all of the same robustness checks across the traits and verbs as well. So we did the leave one out analysis, where we removed any particular trait word or verb word and looked at how much the results was affected by the removal of that particular example. And none of them were particularly affected by particular examples. We chose the set of traits that we had because it was the largest inventory that we could find that was like vetted by people in the field, not just like randomly assumed. It was interesting. We actually looked at a bunch of different types of traits, and the ones that people prefer in NLP seemed to be just some guy's random website. So it was kind of fun to dig into like what is the list that psychologists actually trust, as opposed to just some person's off the top of their head examples. Yeah, but there could be some that we've left out. It's possible. It would be nice too to look at examples that are impossible for men. I haven't done this, but this would be fun, like, pregnant or something.
Right, there must
like
be
what happens with those, just as a baseline.
I mean, one other thing I was wondering about that is, it seems, I guess the basic idea is that the male embeddings are a kind of combination of person and male more than the female embeddings are. And I wonder if that it could be that the similarity of all these traits and things are to the, I wonder if you could tease apart whether the similarity is more to the maleness or the universalness of those embeddings. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it would be basically to look at the similarity with the traits to the person words as well, and see whether those were different from man and woman. We had thought about doing that at some point. I think we have it in some supplementary stuff, but I don't. Yeah, I would have to check it again.
Okay.
That would be cool.
All right, thanks.
This is great, taking lots of notes. Okay. Another thing you might think about doing then, given what you said, sorry, I was thinking about the last point about the man words being kind of a composition of person words and man words. You could think of composing woman words with like people words to see if you could kind of fix it.
Right.
Yeah, it'd be kind of interesting.
Okay, I think we had Paolo and then Joachim.
Thank you very much for the talk. I really enjoyed. And Berta, the social psychologist that we have here at the Technical University of Valencia, with the name of a transformer. Enjoyed even more because always complaining that talks I suggest her to attend are too technical. So this was a really great balance. In relation to one of the things you mentioned as a future work to study a little bit this word embeddings from a non-static perspective,
Mm-hmm.
I would be interested, I think that it could be interesting to see this with respect to the recent past, especially looking at what's going on in Europe, for instance. And now there are, in some countries, right-wing parties that are, getting some popularity. And I think that this entitles people, especially in social media, but not only to, to use certain words in association to women more than maybe some years ago. So I have the feeling that we are going backward than forward. So I think that it could be also interesting to look at this from this perspective, I think.
Yeah, that would be very cool. All of like the ones we've used are just a slice from 2017 of the web, but it would be neat to go backwards in history and even more currently and look at some of the changes over time. There have been some works on word embeddings that have looked at changes in particular words over time, like I'm remembering an example of the word gay and how that changed through its history, but it would be neat to look at something like this as well in its historical path. Yeah, that would be very cool.
I had another question. So you mentioned this finding of a study in an Arab-speaking country that they still use male gendered versions for occupations which are actually more occupied by females, like developers. Is that right?
Oh, it was a similarity between occupation words and stereotyping terms still reflects the same similar gender stereotypes to the US, regardless of the fact that particular occupations are held more by women in the Arabic countries, like programmer or something. So it was a very specific comparison of particular occupations with the percentage of people that were holding those occupations.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dirk, if you want to add something, maybe
But this is really interesting, right? Because it seems to suggest that these gender associations in language do not necessarily reflect cultural norms, right? I mean, if or am I wrong?
Or just that like frequency alone frequency of somebody holding an occupation isn't enough information to change the stereotypes that you would have about them, perhaps. But I feel like I'm maybe not, there was more in that study and I haven't read it that recently. So I'm hoping that I'm describing it perfectly, but if someone,
okay.
yeah, let me send it to you because then.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Follow up on
Thanks
that.
a lot.
Yeah, I think what you just mentioned, like with the saliency effects, that might be something, right? That like I mean, if you're encountering a shark in the ocean, you're very likely to get away unharmed. But like the fact that sharks sometimes attack people sticks much more than like, 99% of all shark encounters are unknown or like, right? So there's this effect maybe. But anyway, so my question was actually, if you have languages where you have to inflect for gender, and now I'm, one of my pet peeves is that people always confuse sort of like biological, social, and grammatical gender and like conflate everything. And it's like, no, grammatical gender is not biological gender. But, that aside, you oftentimes do have to inflect also for male and female gender with a grammatical suffix typically. So do you think in languages where you have that, say Italian, or also German or Spanish, do you think that would, in which direction would that change results? So A, would it change results? And B, then would that make results more salient, or would that change result? Would that make the difference go away for some reason? Do you have an expectation or?
Yeah, I actually have some results. I'm wondering if it makes sense to dive into them though, because I don't have any time to do setup. But yeah, I did some translation from English source sentences to languages like Italian that mark gender. And I looked at occupations that would have some sort of explicit gender marker on them. So that's human denoting words that would get grammatically marked with a masculine or feminine suffix. And looked at sort of if you provide an unambiguous cue to the gender, something like my mother is a plumber. Does plumber end up getting feminine or masculine? So plumber is maybe a more masculine associated occupation, but like, can the translation model at all resolve the fact that mother requires like woman gender? And so we did that and found that like it does much worse on the women's occupations in general. And it does worse when the occupation is mismatched. So if you say like my father is a plumber, the models across like, I think we looked at 20 different languages, one of them was Italian. The translations are better for that one than my mother is a plumber. We also gave stereotypical adjectives like these as sort of an additional cue. And so we would either mismatch that context with the unambiguous trigger or not. So it might be something like my father is a beautiful plumber or something. Once again, when the target or when the trigger is unambiguously male like father, you still see a lot higher percentages for things like beautiful plumber and even things like beautiful nurse for father than you do for the converse. And so we showed sort of accidentally that was like that project wasn't related to this one, but once you start seeing androcentrism effects, it's a lot easier to then just check them across all of your projects. And so there's some evidence cross-lingually that you do get morphological swaps if you include kind of different types of suggestive context or triggering context.
So this is in a translation context.
Yeah, this was in translation and not word embedding. So I haven't checked for multilingual word embeddings.
No, I was wondering if you're within a gender marking language, whether that would sort of like move results one direction or another.
We did look at, I mean, this isn't quite exactly answering your question, but we did look at inanimate noun gender. So that's kind of another interesting case because clearly there's no naturalness to the fact that table is masculine in German. And we found basically a significant amount of information and bits shared between the like word embedding itself and which gender and also noun class that word should appear in. So there is some like kind of information that tells you something about grammatical gender marking, even in a case when there's not actually any semantics. Yeah, so that was kind of fun. But Yeah, it would be interesting to check this for grammatical gender marking languages.
Sorry, just to follow up. So that last part
Mm-hmm.
would indicate that like a native speaker of a gender marking language would have like an intuitive feeling if they're presented with the word Tisch, like they would, like a German child would automatically say der Tisch, not knowing anything else. Like,
I mean, maybe I speculate a bit on what it might be, because there are like the declension
Like
classes in German,
phonotactics or
particularly.
something?
Yeah, we also looked at that. So that also contributes some amount of bits that is not entirely overlapping with the amount you get from word embedding. So that there's a little bit overlapping, but they each contribute separately as well. But like the classes, the gender classes do correlate with other semantic factors. So like self-motive things like planets and stuff seem to fall into the same class. So there's like animacy matters for gender as well. I mean, clearly the human ones. And then there were a couple of other types of information that would allow you to bootstrap. Like let's say if you're a kid learning, that is not just that you think of, you know, table Tisch as a man as like wearing a mustache or something. It's not just that sort of thing. There's a bunch of like sub-semantic information, like different subclasses that kind of can help you to a certain degree. It also varies across class. I mean, yeah, but this is a different project. But yeah, it would be very neat in the context of this to look at gender marking. One tricky thing for the traits is that you have to choose a gender for the traits then, because they're going to agree based on noun concord and the noun phrase. So you might want to do that with traits, the same trait, but inflected in both ways and see what happens. And you get into ungrammaticality. And yeah, there's a bunch of cool things to do there though, for sure.
cool, thanks.
Berta, I think you're up.
Last question or last suggestion or something like that. A major debate between social psychologists and sociologists is if not sexist language helps to combat stereotypes. I mean, it's useful to say, for example, in Spanish, los y las mujeres, no? It's always difficult to use both genders speaking, and maybe it will be interesting to see if in this piece of test where people use this both makes the effort to use a not sexist language, we find less stereotypes in terms of associations that in this piece of test where we don't make this effort. Do you know what I mean? I mean, maybe we need, I mean, for us, for social psychology, to have these tools is like a paradise, because you are able to check things with natural language, and we are only able to check things in laboratories with experimental designs or with interviews, I mean, with artificial language, but you are able to test this with natural. Then will be interesting to see if there is an effect in terms of stereotypes in language, because it's difficult to use both at the same time, and we need the reasons to support this effort. But that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. The last author, Andrei Chimpian, is actually very interested in this social intervention aspect, because he, like a huge portion of his work is with children, and he works on like how the children acquire various generic concepts, not just human concepts, but in general. And he's been very curious to try interventions kind of in relation to this androcentrism space with kids and see if that shifts them at all towards moving away from stereotypes. So I think, yeah, it is kind of an exciting connection with social psychology. I hope that our tools are up for it.
Okay, we're coming up to the limits of our allotted time slot. Great to see a lively discussion. Are there any other questions? All right, doesn't seem like that's the case. So thanks so much, Adina. This was wonderful. I would invite everybody, as we always do in the end, if you can, to turn on your camera and your microphone and actually give Adina a real round of applause. So thank you very much. Okay, so thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Adina, for presenting. This rounds out this semester's round of DMI talks. We will be back in the fall with more exciting speakers, exciting topics from a variety of different backgrounds. In the meantime, keep in touch. Also, Tommaso posted this. We do have our typical aperitivo, which normally we would hold in person after the talk, but well, for now, we will still do it online. So let us know if you want to participate in that. And thanks again also, Adina, for being flexible in that respect.
Yeah, thanks everybody for your awesome questions. If you have any follow-ups, feel free to email me. This is very much ongoing work. And so, yeah, thank you again.
All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.